I went to Colorado a couple of times in the summers and stayed with some relatives and really found porn there and was immediately hooked and, did everything I could to get my hands on porn from there.
It seems like God really put it on your heart to work with men who are dealing, whether it's with pornography or people like me whose story goes way, way beyond porn use.
I had another friend who was going to that small group Bible study who in fact got caught looking at porn over a holiday and got fired for it and had to tell his wife he got fired for it. And it was just brutal.
It's literally in the Great Commission. Christ told us, go and make disciples of all men. So literally from our Savior. So we just go, we show up to a Bible study and we read some verses out loud, and that's discipleship.
He asked me to be his accountability partner. And I'll tell you, that really supercharged and changed my journey. Because, when you're accountable to someone, it makes all the difference in the world.
There's almost this attitude where if you attend a 12-step program, you're failing as a Christian, because you should be able to find your wholeness and your healing 100% at the church. And if you're not doing that, you're a failure as a Christian somehow.
It was truly amazing to see how God worked through the guys' lives that were there, because I don't know it all. I was really, honestly, a facilitator in that, as I am now in Regen.
You don't have to have a PhD and you don't have to be an expert in anything. It's more about just following the obedience there.
God prepares the called. He doesn't call the prepared.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's podcast. I'm Jeremiah Sheppard. I'm filling in this week for Gary Ingram. And first off, before we get started with today's guest, I just want to say thank you to everybody that's joining us today, whether you're coming from Love and Truth Network through Transforming Congregations, our listeners on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, on YouTube Music. We want to welcome all of you and just thank you for growing the channel. So welcome to everybody. For today's guest, we have a special episode here. So oftentimes on this Christian journey that we're all on together, you'll meet people where they're just kind of acquaintances at church, and that's kind of as far as it goes. Maybe sometimes it's a little deeper, a men's group, a women's group, something like that. You might even consider them friends, and that's okay too. But very occasionally, God brings that special person that he's going to use in somebody else's life who is there for the long haul, who's very much about being steadfast, about the ironing, sharpening iron. It's a rare thing when that happens, but it's definitely a blessing. So the person that you're going to be meeting today is definitely one of those people who's made a huge impact in my life, in the lives of many others. I'll let him tell his own story, but I can tell you a whole lot of great things have happened over the last 10 years or so just with me because of Gary Ingram, the director here at Love and Truth Network, who's been a huge impact in my life. That would be one person, but also this man sitting right here, Jim Welton. So, Jim, welcome to our program.
Hey, Jeremiah. Glad to be here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I've been wanting to have you here for months and months now. It just so happened the stars aligned to where we were able to do it today. So I'm excited to have you on. So yeah, I've got a whole list of questions that I want to talk about with you. But before we jump into all of that, just so our listeners have a better idea, tell us some more of your story, kind of your personal testimony and where God has brought you to where you're able to minister to people to the level that you're at now. So tell us some about that.
Sure. So I was born in Denver, Colorado. My father left when I was 18 months old. He was doing drugs and drinking, and he was definitely an alcoholic and was an alcoholic for the rest of his life, to my knowledge. My mom pretty much said, either leave all that or never come back. And apparently he was a man of his word because I never met him. I figured I'd meet him at my grandfather's funeral because I stayed in contact with my grandmother and my grandfather, his parents. And they were sweet, wonderful people who took really good care of me and my older brother, who's 4 years older than me, and my mom. And as time went on, he never returned. As I said, I expected to meet him at my grandfather's funeral, and Mike actually died first, which was kind of wild. I talked to him 3 or 4 times over my life, and that was it, literally. It was crazy. I distinctly remember us having a conversation, you and I and some guys in our group having a conversation when he passed, like, Jeremiah, how should I feel about this? Right? Because, and I explained it like this, it was like, you're dying. I care for you. sure, I'm sad that your uncle passed. And it was about the same because, maybe I've met your uncle 3 or 4 times. You know what I mean? That was it. Right. So, that's definitely one of those things. And the terms I've commonly used for this is wax and lax, right? So those things that whack you in the head and those things that are just lax in your life. And I've definitely had a few of those over my life. And those are super common things that lead men and women into bondage to sin. And that can be anything. It can be porn, it can be gambling, it can be many, many other things, shopping, workaholism, all of those different things. So when I was about 6 years old, my mom married my dad because I have a father and a dad. My dad's name is Les. And Mom and Les got married, and we moved to Utah pretty quick after that. So we went to a small Baptist church there in Utah, and I went there for a few years. As a child, was at a Christian school there for a while. And as a 8 or 9 year old, I asked Jesus into my heart in children's church at a small Baptist church, which was awesome. And so, we went to that church for a number of years. And towards the end, I went to Colorado a couple of times in the summers and stayed with some relatives and really found porn there. And was immediately hooked, and did everything I could to get my hands on porn from there. We moved churches when I was about 14, and I met my wife, and we've been married for 32 years. It'll be 33 here in 2025, and I really struggled during that entire time into my late 20s. I was almost 30 when I really stopped looking at porn, and so I was 17 when we got married. And we moved to Phoenix just a few days after that. We went to a few churches here in Phoenix, Baptist Church, Christian Missionary Alliance Church, which is actually the church we grew up in. It's a denomination for all intents and purposes. And so we tried to find another CMA church when we moved out to the west side of Phoenix in 1998. And did, and met some dear friends there who are friends to this day. And so we got involved in a Bible study, in a small group Bible study with those folks. And at some point in that Bible study, one of those guys comes, and it's couples. Nobody really, I think we had one baby in that group. He comes to that group one day and he said, "Hey, I just really feel led by God to tell you all that I struggled for years with porn and masturbation." And it was like, whoa. Who has the bravery to do that in a small group like that, especially a mixed group, right? And it was just an amazing thing. And, all the guys in there kind of went, yeah, right? And I don't think it really caught the ladies. I don't think they understood what happened. And so I started down this path to get free from that. And I read Every Man's Battle, and I read a few other books, super common at that time. Really, very soon after that, surprisingly soon after that, maybe a year or so later, I had another friend who was going to that small group Bible study who, in fact, got caught looking at porn over a holiday and got fired for it and had to tell his wife he got fired for it. And it was just brutal. And he asked me to be his accountability partner. And I'll tell you, that really supercharged and changed my journey. Because, when you're accountable to someone, it makes all the difference in the world. And we'll talk about that a little later. The last time I voluntarily looked at porn was 2003. And the reason why I say it that way is because the reality is that we live in the world, TV shows are on, stuff goes across there, and you're like, whoa, what was that? You weren't expecting it. We lovingly call that sniper fire. And so I've certainly seen, naked people other than my wife since then, but not voluntarily. And 9 out of 10, I have some methods, some tactics I use for things like that. Every TV show in the world goes through a strip joint at some point. It's insane. Hilariously, if you go back to Touched by an Angel, at some point, there's a strip club in that show. And you're like, how's that a thing? That should not be a thing, but it is.
It's like, is this something like standard in Hollywood that nobody told us about? It's like
exactly.
Something or other. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And so honestly, I'll do this. I'll just, put my hand up and say, babe, tell me when it's gone. or my knee or something. And it's really surprising at how quick those scenes are gone and how much your life is truly impacted by not taking those images in. As a man, honestly, ladies, if you're listening, guys, if you're listening, guys are super affected by what they see, right? They think about things, they imagine things, sure, but they're very, very much visually stimulated. That's why porn was primarily a male thing for the longest period of time. I'll be honest with you, I believe that women's lib and some of those things have brought it over to the other side, which is kind of not a side effect I think they were looking for, but that's truly my belief of what's happened there.
Oh, for sure. It used to be like, porn was a man thing, and, women, it was more the romance novels, which those are pretty raunchy just on their own, but it was supposedly a separate issue. But now more and more and more women are getting hooked on the visual, the triple X, hardcore pornography the same way that men are. Not to the same percentages yet, but it's climbing every single year. So you're absolutely right about that.
Absolutely. So we, rolled along for a few years. We had 2 boys. Our twins are 20 now. That's shocking to me. And we really came to this point where we had some friends that were living in Honduras as missionaries working at an orphanage. And they were close friends of ours. And I'll use their name here. And they, they would send us newsletters. And so my job, I was working for American Express at the time, and they're like, we're outsourcing your department. I'm like, well, great. And, I said to Wendy, jokingly, like, hey, maybe we should just go live in Honduras with Eric and Kim. Ha, 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 ha. Right. And what was interesting is Wendy and I had both picked up that newsletter and read that. And it said, we need house parents. We need missionaries who will come down and be foster parents. And I thought, I'd be willing to do that. I don't know if Wendy would do that, but I'd do it. And so, interestingly, a God incidence there, right? Wendy did the same. Like, she read that and she's like, I don't think Jim would ever do that. And so, when that opportunity came to leave that particular job, we both, kind of looked at each other and said, well, what if we did do that? Right. So we started checking into it. And we went to church and spoke to the missions pastor at our church. And it was a pretty funny conversation because, we talked to him about it a little and we knew absolutely nothing. I mean, literally nothing about what we were doing or going to do or any of those things. And he's like, so how long has that company, that organization been in place? And we're like, I don't know. And, it's called World Gospel Outreach. How many countries are they in? And we're like, I don't know. Like, maybe we should know those things. And he's like, maybe you should, bud. You know what I mean? Wow, you kids are new. Okay. And so we looked into those things and talked to that organization and really just, walked down that path. Interestingly, that was 2008, 2009. An awesome time to be fully, fundraising for full support. Yeah, not really.
Oh, right. During the financial crisis and everything else. But yeah, that's...
So we really raised full funding, which is, kind of a big deal in 10 months. The average is 18 to 24, as I understand it. And so, I'm not saying I'm proud or what, that was really God doing that. We just did what we could do and kept moving forward. And, we really just said to people, look, this is what we're doing. We're caring for orphaned kids. We're, going to do it in Honduras, all of those things. If your heart is about that, then you should give to what we're doing. And if your heart isn't about that, you need to go find what it's about and give to that, because God has blessed us in so many ways. And I kind of came up with this, abject riches saying that I would say, it's like, hey, I'm really just asking you to skip a few, Starbucks. That's really all we're asking for here. We're so well off, so cared for in this country. It's just shocking. And, you don't really realize that until you're standing in a third world country going, wow, right? The place we worked was up on a mountain outside of a city called Tegucigalpa, which is the capital city of Honduras. And, on the way up there, it was kind of the worst camping road you've ever been on to get up there. And, there was this one spot that was just the corner of a mountain, and you looked out over the entire valley, and it had a shack on it that was probably 200 square feet at best. I'd be surprised if it was 200 square feet. And we called that the $100 house with the $1 million view. And every once in a while we'd stop and look at the view and then, get back in the van and keep going. And so we lived there for about 3.5 years. We took in a number of kids. We had we have some interesting stories that go along with that. I'll just tell one quick one there. The one I like to tell is the one where and I'll kind of give away the ending right here at the beginning, but I realized this kid had never been in warm water. So, you get a kid from that system there in Honduras, the same way you get a kid from a system here, and you take them home, and the first thing you do is you bathe them for lice. You do the lice treatment because they all have lice. This is just it's not even a discussion. It's a certainty. And so at the time, my boys were, I think they were 6. And so I had been bathing little boys for years. And so, I take him in there and I take all his clothes off, and I hold him out over the water, and he starts screaming bloody murder. And I mean screaming, right? And I'm like, shocked, I'm looking at him like, uh-oh, and I'm trying to figure out, like, did I pinch him? Like, what happened? And so I'm like, okay. And so I set him down towards the water, and his toes touch the water, and he goes silent. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, what happened? Right. And so I put him in the bath, and we do the bath, normal bath stuff. And I, get him all cleaned up and get him out. And he seems all happy about it. And I'm like, all right. Like most kids like the bath. Sure. Right. So I literally thought about that for 2 or 3 days. Like it was not minutes. It was not hours. It was a long time. And it like smacked me in the head. That kid had never been bathed in warm water, and he thought it was going to be super cold. And that's why he was screaming. And I was like, oh gosh. And that's just one of the many stories, and I have plenty of those. So we lived on the ranch for about 3.5 years. It was called Rancho Ebenezer. The organization was called World Gospel Outreach. They're in Honduras and Belize at this point. So as we lived there, we had always lived in the high desert. So Utah, the area we lived in was kind of central eastern Utah. The town is called Price, and that was high desert for sure. And then we moved here to Phoenix, which is obviously desert. And, we had just never been around the wet, the mold, all of that. So we got to Honduras and really learned that Wendy had a pretty bad mold allergy. And by the time we left, I think she was taking 6 separate allergy medicines on a daily basis and was kind of a zombie because allergy medicines really mess with her. They make her really drowsy. It was bad. And the COO, the chief operating officer of that organization, came to our house and said, you guys, dead missionaries look bad on the end of your report. You're moving home. And we were like, but we committed to 4 years. He's like, Jim, anybody else would have left 6 months ago. Man, I love you. You guys got to go home. And we're like, all right, and we weren't happy about it. And we had literally just moved there. I mean, and what I mean by that is we had moved there to live there forever. Like that was how we moved there. We hadn't planned anything else. And so God had other plans, and those plans were to bless us and to care for Wendy, which was great. So we moved back to the States in 2014. That doesn't sound right. 2013. We moved back to the States in 2013. And I, as quickly as I could, found a job and just, found a place to live, all that kind of stuff. We needed plates, we needed forks, we needed mattresses, we needed everything, right? So we really started over at that point. We traveled around a little in 2013, thanked the churches who had supported us, went home, saw our parents, that kind of stuff, right? And then, came back to Phoenix and started working at American Express. I'd been a server administrator, still had my technical skills, and, put them to work for me. Was really blessed with a gig, working for a small bank here. Was super thankful for a friend of mine who had worked at American Express who called me and was like, come work with me. And I'm like, great. And he's like, I wouldn't do this, but you need a job and I don't want you to starve to death. And I'm like, thank you. And that was awesome. Interestingly, before we left for Honduras, I want to tell another part of my recovery story, which is I never really had that discussion with Wendy. Hey, I've been looking at porn for years. That never really came up. And I had, said to her and started some of the tactics of, not watching the stuff on TV and, that kind of thing. And she, I don't know, she must have just thought I was just trying to be a holy guy. I don't know. And so I had started going to a purity group with a bunch of guys from my church and just loved it and was super excited about it and was helping those guys move forward in their journeys. And came home super excited about it. And Wendy was like, what are you so excited about? And I'm like, I'm excited to see see these guys getting free. And she's like, free from what? And she's a bright lady. She did the math. And she's like, that means you weren't free at some point. And so, after about 6 years, I did the math today. I usually say 7, but I was wrong. After about 6 years, I was back in the doghouse for something that I hadn't done in years. And I was a little frustrated about that. I'll be honest with you. But also, I hadn't told her, right? So, one of the keys to that situation was certainly her speaking to the wife of the leader of the purity group I was going to. And that lady gave her a book by Shanti Feldhan, called For Women Only. I have not read that book, I'm just being clear. And it really helped her. And I was super thankful because she forgave me. She forgave me for doing stupid stuff for years. Now, one of the questions you have later that I'm going to answer now is, what pitfalls have you seen guys fall into when having that very awkward conversation? And truly, a big part of that, one of the biggest pitfalls I've seen there is prematurely telling them, I've quit porn, and it's not true, right? I walked away from all that. I'll never do that again. Sure.
And they're back at it next week. They have the best of intentions, but they're not walking in freedom yet.
And what happens is they break their wife's heart over and over. You can only do that so many times. And then you don't have a wife. That is really kind of how that's gone. And, I've seen the opposite happen too, where guys have gotten free and talked to their wives and then they were in the doghouse forever, because she was still hurting. And we'll talk about that a little more. But, we came back from Honduras and I got back into that same purity group and just started rolling along. And that was a purity group where I met you. And we had that leader who was in that group had some struggles, and he's like, hey, I need somebody to take over. And Jim, that's you. And I was like, okay. And we rolled on, and we had gone through a video series called the Conquer series. And that was a great, great series. I thought it was amazing.
Yes.
And it had a not a 12-step exactly, but a similar program called the 7 Pillars. And the 7 Pillars had some reading and a workbook, and you really kind of walked through your entire life and as an analogy, looked through every window of your life from a bunch of perspectives. Tell me about your 10 best days. Tell me about your 10 worst days. Tell me about the 10 worst things that have ever happened to you. Tell me about the 10 best things that have ever happened to you. And that was a life-changing thing for me, even after being free from porn for a number of years. And it was truly amazing to see how God worked through the guys' lives that were there, because I don't know it all. I was really, honestly, a facilitator in that, as I am now in Regen, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and had really pushed hard to help those guys to get through that work, to get through that system, and really let the Holy Spirit do his work and come out the other side free or radically less hurt. Because the real reason guys show up to those groups is because if I could stop doing this one thing, my life would be eternally better. Sometimes it's porn, sometimes it's other things, sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's, sex. And while sex and porn seem to be the same thing, they aren't exactly. I had a guy in one of the groups that I'd been in that said, I keep sleeping with women that aren't my wife, and I'm like, okay. And, sometimes it's gambling. There are a bunch of different things. And commonly what those things are is they are a salve for those whacks and lacks that I talked about earlier, that they're trying to salve something in their life. And it's not that if I could stop doing this one thing, it's what's under the one thing that you're trying to stop doing, right?
Well, and if you don't mind, Jim, I'd like to stop there for just a minute, because in terms of your personal story, this has kind of fascinated me for a long time. So you were, you had some issues with porn here and there growing up, but you got married at 17. You've been with the same woman ever since then. You were a Christian missionary. You have a tech job. So, you have this quote unquote very, very respectable life. So you could have just joined a Bible study, or if you really wanted to do the amazing thing to really impress people at church and really put on the great appearance, after coming back from Honduras, you could have worked with foster kids here in the States, and that would have seemed very logical and everything. And I'm not like poo-pooing anybody that does that. The point that I'm getting at is that would have been an expected road, you might think, but instead it seems like God really put it on your heart to work with men who are dealing, whether it's with pornography or people like me whose story goes way, way beyond porn use. And I know I'm not the only one that has helped with that. So there's a reason, because I want to come back to another question a little bit later in the program, but I would really like to hear just kind of, how did God put that on your heart? Was this just something that grew over time? Was this, you go to that group once and then it's like, okay, wow, I really see the need here. How did the Lord bring it about for you to really minister in this arena when it's not necessarily been something that not only do most people not want to minister there, they stay away from it as far as possible. So how did that come about for you, just in terms of how did God bring you to that place?
I think it had a lot to do with joining that purity group before I left. I did a very similar group the entire time we were on the ranch with the guys that were there. Accountability is such an important thing. And I know you've heard me say this and I'll say it again. So I believe that true freedom is accountability in every area of your life. Now you're going to go, Jim, you're crazy, because the world screams at us that the lack of accountability and the presence of unlimited funds is true freedom in your life. And the faces, names, and otherwise are splashed across the pages of the tabloids that you see in the supermarket aisle of anyone who even gets close to that position, much less in it. And the reality is that in every area of your life that you can stay accountable, you're free. Because no one can ever come up to you and go, hey, have you been looking at porn? Most Christian men would scream and run in the other direction, whether they've been looking or not.
Right. Or they would act so offended. How dare you ever imply that
exactly.
I'm capable of such a thing?
Don't impugn me honor, boy. Right? To quote a pirate. And, the reality of that is, I'm free of that. Somebody can walk up to me and I can say, yeah, how can I help you? Like, I've walked away from that. How can I help you walk away from that? Because again, it's not that that's hurting them. Something else has hurt them. And we must, with the Holy Spirit's help, dig down to find that thing. And there are a number of 12-step programs out there. The reality of the 12-step program that I'm really running with now, which is called Regen, it's called Regeneration. It's out of Watermark Church in Texas. And Regeneration really is just a 12-step discipleship program. So when I was talking to some of the other leaders that are in there with me, and I just said, it wasn't in order for sure, but don't you really see how Jesus walked the disciples through the 12-step program over time? Again, it wasn't in order per se, but those 12 steps really have amazing effects on your life.
No,
I agree. The same in this program as in the last, I really am just a facilitator. So to your question, I want to answer that directly. God prepares the called. He doesn't call the prepared. I found that very true in going to Honduras. That was harder than I ever could have imagined. No one would sign up for that if they knew what was going on. You know what I mean? And I don't mean knew what was going on. If they knew how difficult it would be, right? Being a missionary is a very difficult thing. And the same with this, it wasn't like something I was like, let's do this, one day. It was really just, I loved seeing people lay their heart at Christ's feet and walk away from the sins that have plagued them for their entire lives. And I really believe so many times, we've had guys in our groups that were doing gay hookups on Craigslist and other things that were going to get them a disease or murdered, or there are many consequences that could go along with that, including divorce, including loss of job, including all kinds of other things that could come into that. And I don't want to say that's the craziest thing, because I don't mean it like that. That's just one of those things. And, you're talking married guys, right? And the reality is that they were desperately trying to salve the hurts in their lives. The hurts in my life are pretty obvious, right? My father leaving. My mom had some mental challenges over my life and ended up in a mental hospital a few times when I was younger. And it was, that was another lack in my life. Interestingly, and I've talked to her about this, one of the things that I needed to do in that process was forgive those people, right? So I needed to forgive Mike for leaving. I needed to forgive my mom for being in the hospital. You're like, wait a minute, that wasn't her fault. That wasn't her doing. It wasn't. That's correct. What it was a lack in my life. And I needed to forgive that lack and be free of it. So one of the sayings that I say a lot is forgiveness is for the forgiver in every case but Christ. And I challenge you to prove me wrong. I've never heard one.
Right.
Because so often,
such a good point right there. Yeah.
When you offer someone forgiveness, they kind of look at you like, huh. Interestingly, I did call Mike once when we were home on furlough from Honduras and said, hey, if there's anything that you need my forgiveness for, you think you need my forgiveness for, you got it. And he said, okay.
And that was it? No.
Yeah, I left that awkward pause because that's what happened. And I said, have a great day. And he said, thanks. And we hung up, literally. And that really taught me that forgiveness was for me forgiving him. I needed to be free of that, right? Because, again, forgiveness is one of those things, and we've all heard these analogies, but, it's drinking poison and hoping your enemy dies.
Right.
It really is just hurting you. It is not hurting them, right? So, that's a big piece that I really want people to hear is how much, in my life, those lacks and those whacks in my life. Sure, I had other whacks in my life, other things that just cracked me in the head and beat us up, but that I was trying to salve with porn that I needed to lay at Christ's feet, right? So there's a reason it's 12 steps and not one.
And on that note, I would really... So for people that are listening, let's say that God has really put it on their heart, right? They really want to minister in this area, but they think to themselves, okay, I'm not a counselor. I'm not a therapist. I don't have a degree. I don't have specialized training. Plus, okay, I haven't had, maybe I've looked at porn once or twice, but I'm a heterosexual person. I've never dealt with same-sex attraction. I've never had a gay hookup. I've never cheated on my wife. I mean, I really see the hurt there, and I really feel like I want to help these people, but who the heck am I to say anything? I don't have the expertise. I don't have the training, and I also don't have the same story as theirs. So I have nothing to offer. I have nothing that I could possibly give. So they just kind of hang back. Even if they have the Holy Spirit, like really putting a burden on them, they just feel like I guess what I'm trying to say is they feel like they're not qualified.
Right.
That they're stepping into an area that they have no right to speak into and that they're just not qualified. So I would really love for you to speak into that because, to my point earlier, okay, so you are a heterosexual man. You've been faithful to your wife. And I'm not saying you've been perfect. I'm not saying you're a saint. Obviously, pornography is an issue. There's other things. But you haven't led the life of brokenness and bad choices and all of that so many of the rest of us have done. But that's also, Jim, that's never stopped you from being so willing to pour into us, so willing to get educated about stuff if you needed to, ask some of those questions. So I would just really love to hear, speak directly to the heart of somebody who might be feeling a draw to help here, but feels like they're not qualified to do so.
So there are a couple of 12-step programs that are out there. One's called Celebrate Recovery, and one's called Regeneration. And usually I've seen folks, and I have seen a number of folks come through our program who couldn't sit there and say, hi, my name is Jim, and God is and I have a new life in Christ, and God is recovering me from porn, from, whatever. They couldn't say that because that wasn't what they were recovering from. Some of them said pride. You're like, pride? Really? 12-step program for pride? Oh, yeah. So discipleship is discipleship, and we'll get to that in a little while, but the reality is that those 12-step programs put you in a situation where you run through your entire life, you look at the whole thing, you compare it to Christ and not to others, right? You definitely draw close to him. You deal with the things that have happened in your life, even if they're not as extreme as some situations. And you then are far closer to Christ because discipleship is, in fact, becoming like Christ, not becoming like Jim.
Right, right.
And so going through the program yourself and then becoming a leader in that program, you're given the tools to do the things that you need to do. And 9 out of 10, you're not being asked to have all the answers. And actually, you should never be asked to have all the answers. I'm sure your director would agree he doesn't have all the answers.
Right.
The reality is that I am pointing people back to Christ. One of the things that you and I have talked about many, many times over is run to Christ. Flee. That term flee, what does that mean? It means run scared like a little girl, right? And not that girls are bad. It's just, kind of an analogy, right? Run scared like a scared child to God and say, God, save me. Cry out to him and say, God, save me from this. And he will. He will. God answers those who cry out to him. The Bible is very specific about that. And so for those who feel unqualified, welcome to the club. We all are.
Right.
And I would encourage you to daily run to Christ. because, eating slightly too much. Yeah, that's the same thing as porn. Yeah. So the reality is that any sin in your life has the same effect in heaven, and they have different effects on earth. In heaven, it separates you from God. Lie, cheat, steal, whatever, insert your sin here. Think bad thoughts about your cat. I don't know. And you have sinned against God. If that's the case, I'm not sure thinking bad thoughts about your cat is, included in that. But you sinned against God and you're separated from God in a way, right? Now, those things all have different consequences on earth where, today in society, looking at porn probably isn't even looked down on. It's kind of creepy, but true. If you murder someone, you're separated from God. Okay, that has different consequences here on earth, right? But the same consequences in heaven. And so again, run to Christ. And most of what I do is point people to Christ, really, and facilitate groups talking about the things that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so you don't have to have a PhD and you don't have to be an expert in anything. It's more about just following the obedience there. And also it seems, and you've probably been around more churches than I have. It seems, at least in the evangelical kind of Protestant world, 12-step programs are kind of looked down upon by a lot of people in the church, certainly by church leadership. I think they tolerate AA for the most part just because so many people have benefited from it. But when you're talking about a program like Regeneration, Celebrate Recovery, some of the other ones, there's almost this attitude where if you attend a 12-step program, you're failing as a Christian because you should be able to find your wholeness and your healing 100% at the church. And if you're not doing that, you're a failure as a Christian somehow. That's not been my experience at all, but I would love to hear your take on that as well, because to your point, it's based on Christian principles, number one, but looking at some of these areas, it really forces us to take a different way of approaching the Lord. So I don't see these as a negative, but what's been your experience? Because you've been, to your point as well, you've been involved with a couple of them facilitating by this point. So how have you seen, and I'm talking specifically for Christian believers, how have you seen those impact lives and marriages and all that?
So it is interesting because I've seen both sides of that. So one church, we had a pastor from that church who was coming to our group and who was awesome and could speak biblically into a bunch of situations that I just couldn't. Again, I didn't need to be the expert, right? And I don't know if it was the head pastor, but some of another pastor in that church would say, "So how are the degenerates doing?" It was awesome. Yeah.
Wow.
It was pretty out there, right? So then I've also seen the other side of that coin where the current church I go to, which is called Faith Bible Church here in Phoenix, Arizona. It's actually in Glendale, Arizona. We talk about church should be a hospital. The pews should be full because there are tons of hurting people in the world. And the reality is that we all have that God-shaped hole. And that's the only thing that fits in there, even though we throw porn and money and sex and drugs and all of that into there. It falls like a penny into the Grand Canyon. It doesn't matter what it is. That hole was designed for God to fill your life and to care for you. And he's more than willing to do so if you'll open your heart to him. The challenge is so often we have people who either want to gatekeep or they want to say that God isn't enough. I've definitely seen people who say, "Oh, I can't forgive myself." So you're telling me that, Christ's sacrifice on the cross was not enough for your sin. That seems unlikely. Not trying to be ornery, but, think about that, right? And so, it is that you do have to find a church that is, supportive. And if yours doesn't happen to be, there are other churches out there. And I'm not suggesting you change churches. I'm suggesting you get involved in one of these programs and you really run to Christ.
Yeah, and just for anybody listening, I'd like to tack onto that as well. Look, whether your struggle is with alcohol, with drugs, certainly those are big issues. But also, if you're struggling with sexual sin of some kind, whether it's a pornography issue, compulsive masturbation, or whether it's gone beyond that, and you might be into a full blown sex addiction at this point, whatever your situation is, please don't let. I want to be very careful and respectful about how I say this, but please don't let the religious churchianity crowd tell you that if for you to seek help at a 12-step or somewhere else that you're doing something wrong, that you're failing as a Christian. Unfortunately, sometimes the local churches don't have all the answers. And for some of us whose lives are out of control and Believe me, if self-effort and reading the self-improvement books and trying to figure it out on my own, as Jim well knows, I was beating my head against that brick wall for years. It did not work. And as a matter of fact, I would get a couple of days or a couple of weeks. And when I did finally relapse, I couldn't just go doing what I was doing before. I had to go to a whole new low, had to take it above and beyond even where I was into before. So for anybody listening, if that's a situation, just know that there is help out there here at Love and Truth Network. Go to loveandtruth.network.com. We have a whole list of resources there. But wherever it is, never be ashamed to seek out help, and never think that a 12 step is a moral failing, a character failing, a failing as a Christian of some kind, because the help there can be immense. So I just, apologies, Jim. I didn't mean to talk over the top of you there, but I just felt like that was put out there for our listeners. And tell us a little bit too, because another privilege I've had, ladies and gentlemen, I've known Jim for many years at this point. I've also gotten to meet his lovely wife on a number of occasions. And the word in the Old Testament when God was creating Adam and Eve and the helpmates, it doesn't really translate well in the English, but I can tell you, Miss Wendy, she's one of the most incredible spouses that I've seen, and not just in terms of how great the marriage is, even though it absolutely is, but just how supportive she's been. I'm sure it's annoying to have your husband talking to somebody on the phone several times a week for an hour or so for each person. But she's always been so willing to do that. She's been very supportive. So for the spouses that are out there, okay, so they're not the ones dealing with the darn porn issue. They're not the ones who have had to go to these groups and do all of this stuff. That's fine. But what would you have to say to and by the way, I don't mean wives, because to our point earlier, sometimes women are getting into these things too. So there might be some husbands out there whose wives are dealing with a porn addiction or a sex addiction. So, Jim, just from your heart, what would you like to say to some of the spouses that are out there that either are furious, they're hurting, they're not even sure if they should stay in the marriage, or like Wendy is, they see the need for this and they're really wanting to be supportive and they want to be a help, but they're not quite sure what they should be doing. So, what based off of your experience at this point, what would you say to some of those people?
Sure. So I think where I'd go with that is, starting back at those purity groups that I was in, I saw a lot of guys get free. And their wife was still, pardon the expression, but bloody on the floor. Like, realize that your porn use breaks her heart. Realize that in general, women run to food when they're hurting. Not always. Absolutely not always. But it's most common. Men run to porn when they're hurting. Most common. Again, not always, right? I've certainly met guys that are like, I couldn't care less about that. It's fine. And guys that I believe versus the ones I don't. No offense, to anybody, right? But the thing that I would say there is that is a lack and a whack both in your life generally, right? And you need healing the same as they do. Or you're going to run to something else that is more socially acceptable, but it's still going to damage you and damage your life. And so my recommendation would be that you both get involved in a regeneration or a Celebrate Recovery and go through that program together. Because as you do that, number one, your ability to let the Holy Spirit into your heart, into your life, and allow the Holy Spirit to really do his work and care for you is broadened so much. And that's one of the things that I really have seen in regeneration as I've gone through it, is spouses showing up. And eventually, Wendy went through regeneration herself and has become a leader now, and will most likely be leading a step group here in 2025.
Wow.
I've led a step group for a few times. I think I'll be leading my third or fourth step group in regeneration here in 2025. That's the plan. Just to call it out. So we are opening up new folks coming into Regen on, I believe, the 6th of January. So we have a new class starting of 2025, right? Okay. So if you're hurting right now, you're in the Phoenix area, we'd love to see you. Look it up. It's Faith Bible Church in Glendale, Arizona. And, we do about 6 weeks generally of groundwork, which really gets folks, kind of understanding where we're going, those kind of things. We have, folks that are in church, folks that have never been churched, right? And then you move off into a step group that's a closed group where you have a set number of people that are in that group, and you go through the entire program together. And so we've really seen huge, huge gains for folks. And what I mean by that is gains in their relationship with each other, gains in their relationship with God, really laying things at God's feet and being done with them. right? Because the reality is that if you have something that you're addicted to in your life and you're able to walk away from it, just sheer will, something similar, you have not in fact dealt with the core issue.
Right.
And that core issue will keep coming up in your life, and it will come up some other way. It'll be food. It'll be exercise. I once heard somebody say, bodybuilding is the most selfish sport on the planet. Like something like that, where you're just, going for it. And I'm not saying bodybuilders are bad people. That's not what I mean.
Right.
I mean, you will fill that God-shaped hole with something else because you haven't dealt with the underlying problem. So, really, Wendy has done an amazing job of caring for me. I was truly humbled and amazed that she forgave me. And no, I didn't deserve it. And that's kind of the point of forgiveness. No one deserves it, right? It must be given. And so, that forgiveness freed her, right? And then, she went through regen and was like, well, I'm not really addicted to anything. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what I even say. Because, at the beginning of every class or whatever, the leader and most of the folks who speak, the first time they speak, they say that saying I said earlier: hi, my name is Jim. I have a new life in Christ, and God is recovering me from an addiction to porn and selfishness. Obviously, that's very, very rehearsed and what I say most of the time. And this week, from food and sugar, which is an odd thing to say this time of year, but really wanting to follow Christ and really wanting to, have a good diet and do the right things in my life so I stay healthy, because I only have one of these lives. And, I love my wife. I love my boys. I really want to be there for them. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. And having done this for so long and been facilitating these for so long, and obviously, don't go into any personal details or identifiable information, but tell us about some of the successes or some of the breakthroughs or some of the healed marriages that you've seen. What are just some of those things where when you think back on it, you're like, wow, God just did an incredible amount of work here.
So I've really seen folks walk away from those addictions. That's the one thing. That's a big thing. But, it's funny, in regeneration, one of the folks that wrote that, his name is Nate. And Nate says we're not really looking for dry drunks. We're looking for saved souls. And so while it seems odd to say, our goal isn't for you to walk away from your addiction, that should be the effect eventually, don't get me wrong. But our goal is for you to know Christ. Our goal is, in fact, discipleship, which, discipleship is, in American churches today, it's kind of misunderstood. We think of discipleship as, well, I go to this Bible study, so I'm being discipled, right?
100%. And it's so hard because it's literally in the Great Commission. Christ told us, go and make disciples of all men. So literally from our Savior. But and again, maybe it's an American thing, it's a Western church thing, but okay, we're discipling people. So we just go, we show up to a Bible study and we read some verses out loud.
And that's discipleship? I don't think so.
But that's kind of where
discipleship is.
Where what I could tell you in the audience, ladies and gentlemen, is among the many things, aside from being a friend and just somebody that poured a whole lot into me over these past several years. I won't even tell you how many times this poor guy's helped me work on my car. That's a whole completely different subject. But with Jim, the level of discipling that he was doing with me, and I couldn't have even put words to it at the time. I didn't have the vocabulary for it. But I will say from personal experience, it's been one of the single biggest things in my own recovery and my own emerging from the dumpster fire that my life was in when I first started going to the group that I met Jim at. So, Jim, from your perspective, and whether it's with me or many of the others, how would you define discipleship in the way that you do it and many of the others do it, in contrast to the way it's presented most often in church these days?
In my mind, discipleship is a lifelong relationship. And it's a lifelong relationship with God. And it's digging through your entire life to understand the things that have happened to you and by you. And then it really is dealing with those things and getting closer and closer to Christ. So, I talked about guys doing gay hookups earlier. That never scares me. You know why that doesn't scare me? Because as you get closer and closer to Christ, he is a refining fire, and that stuff will burn off. And if they run away from Christ, they run away from Christ. Right. That's their deal. One of the things that we talk about in Regen often in leaders' meetings is you can't want it more for them than they want it for themselves.
Mm-hmm. So true.
Right? And so, discipleship specifically, in Regen, you have a mentor, as they call it. And it's kind of that idea of a sponsor. And you really need to find that person in your life. Sure, we can find a good Christian man or woman who can help you with that. But the reality is we're looking for you to have somebody who's going to be in your life for the rest of your life, and someone you're going to be honest with. It's a known scary fact that most men in America don't have anyone that knows everything about them. Mm-hmm. And they are living without accountability. And that means they're living in the dark. And bad things happen in the dark. And the reality is that you must live with accountability in your life. You must have someone who knows everything about you. And it's truly shocking at how many times folks kind of muster the strength to go through their entire confession, everything that they've ever done, bad or good or whatever in their life, and get to the other end, and the person who's sitting there goes, uh-huh. And they're shocked, and they're like, wait, what? I thought you were going to freak out and run from the room and scream and yell at me and tell me I'm a bad person. And,
oh, yeah. I was a couple of different times. When I did my step 5 with you guys, I thought, I'm going to lose every friend that I've got. This is the night that it's going to happen. I remember that, thinking that at the time. Yeah.
And the reality is that so often people are like, and I've done terrible things in my life too, right? I'm not perfect. You're not asking me to forgive you in most cases, and so having that person in your life that you tell the whole truth to is super important. And staying accountable long term, keeping short accounts is what I call it, right? So not letting things go on and on because, I've definitely seen where people are like, I'm going to take that to the grave, right? And it has to come across like that, raw, and you're like, no, that's just going to hurt you more. And you must confess that. You must lay that at Christ's feet. Reality is that you, in fact, are healed in a way that you can't imagine through that biblical commandment of confess your sins one to another.
No, absolutely. And actually on that note, Jim, I would like to, as we're drawing closer to the end here, at this stage in the editing process, I'm going to put you on full screen. And I just would really like to give you the opportunity from your heart, and very specifically to men or women that are out there that are either watching or listening. Look, you've got a problem with porn, or you've got a problem with cheating on your wife, whatever your situation may be. You haven't felt like you have the freedom to go get help. You don't feel like there's anybody that you could really talk to. I mean, we've all been there. We've all rehearsed all the lies. We know where that's at. There's a gentleman with me today that's getting interviewed right now that has a heart for people that are in your situation. So, Jim, I would just like to, the ball is in your corner. I would just love for you to be able to speak to anybody out there right now who is listening, who really needs to hear what you're going to have to say to them.
So if you believe that you are in fact unreachable, you're wrong. If you believe that you've done things that no one can forgive, you're wrong. Christ specifically said, I've forgiven those sins. And honestly, it's really not about what you do. So I'll give it a quick example, one that I've given many times and one that I really stand on in a lot of ways. So there were 2 guys that were crucified with Christ. And one of those guys mocked him, like, save us, what are you doing? And the other guy was like, don't you fear God at all? You're going to meet him in like 20 minutes. Like, are you crazy? He said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Christ said, and to my knowledge, and I haven't had anybody say this, check me on this one, please, but he is the only guy that Christ said you'll be in heaven directly. So was it about anything he did? It was not. He was literally, generally we think he was nailed to that cross. He might have been tied. That was another method they had until he died. And I hope and pray that was only an hour or 2 later, because it likely wasn't. It was likely many hours later, and true suffering happened between those times. But Jesus, in his own words, said that guy would be in heaven. You'll be with me today in paradise. That is what he said, right? And so what I'm saying to you, if you're listening, is find your rock bottom. You get to choose it. Your rock bottom could be cheating on your wife. Your rock bottom could be, many, many other things, right? Find your rock bottom and find it quickly. You get to decide what rock bottom is. And get to one of these groups. Get to a regeneration group. There's many around the country. Regeneration.org, you can look it up. There's a number of places that you can go across the country to get into that program. The same with Celebrate Recovery. I don't happen to know that website off the top of my head, but that's another one that is all over the country. Get into one of those groups and just start stepping. Take the next step. Take the next step. It's how you learn. It's how you do anything. It's the elephant example. You can't eat an elephant in one bite. It's one bite at a time. You have to cut it down to a tiny little bite, an inch by an inch by an inch. And there you go. Chew it up. And then you take the next bite. So I'm not saying stop doing whatever you feel you're addicted to. I'm saying take the next step. Go to one of these groups. Show up. That is honestly the hardest thing for most people to do, is to walk through the doors of that church the first time. And you'll hear stories in every one of these testimonies of people who were like, hey, I used to do this and I used to do that. And I used to do all these things. And I hated myself for it. And I had no love in my life. And it just, was going horribly. And they went and they ran to Christ over and over and over. So that would be my advice, is to get to a group and a system that can guide you through this process. Because if you could have done it yourself, I love you, you would have done it yourself.
No, for sure, ladies and gentlemen. And for those of you, again, who are listening, don't fall for the lie where you're just one podcast away, you're just one self-improvement book away, that you're going to somehow figure it out. For two reasons. One, we can't get free on our own. Unfortunately, the 99% of the time, that's not going to work out right. But the second thing is, your sin will find you out. And for some of us, we had to learn that the hard way. So right now, hopefully your marriage hasn't blown up yet, or you haven't done something to get yourself arrested, or you haven't had to lose your job yet. Hopefully it's not come to that. Be willing to reach out prior to the coming to that point, please. And just know that there is help out there. There's Regeneration Ministries. There's Celebrate Recovery. We have resources here at Love and Truth Network, but absolutely don't hesitate to reach out, because to Jim's point, and again, we're going to be respecting everybody's privacy on here, but just because of the 10 plus years that I've known him, been in groups with him, seen the people that he's ministering to, we're not just talking about men that have had an issue with pornography. Okay. There's men that are married to women that have a wife at home, but they're out cheating with other men that they met on the internet. There's been people that are on the sex offender list. There's people that have lost jobs because of the sex addiction that they have going on. I mean, there's been all kinds and all varieties of people that Jim has ministered to over the years. So there is help out there, and I would just greatly encourage anybody who may be struggling with that. Regeneration Ministries is out there. We're not going to post anybody's personal information on here. If for some reason you would like to reach out to Jim Welton directly, log on to loveandtruthnetwork.com, send us a message, let us know that it's for Jim. We're more than happy to forward that over to him. On our end, we can take care of that for you. But yeah, Jim, thanks again for taking the time. I know it's December and this is a busy time of year, and you full-time job and the family at home. So I really appreciate you taking the time with us and our listeners here today.
Absolutely. And just, hear from my heart that I'm only here for one reason: to make much of Christ, to be his servant, and to lay your lives at his feet. Because I got nothing. I'm nobody. I'm just being honest. I've always seen myself as nobody. I'm the youngest in my family, was the youngest for all of my life. And, being 50 years old now, I'm finally not the youngest in certain places. It's crazy. Hilariously, I have some 80 plus year old friends, and I've had a number of them in our groups. And one of the funny things that I always say, they always say is, you'll have a 20 or 30 year old in that group say, when do women stop looking good? When does porn stop looking good? And they usually say, I'll let you know. and the joke in that is, it's Christ you need to run to, nothing else.
Absolutely. So, well, ladies and gentlemen listening, thank you again for joining us for this episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. So, Love and Truth Network listeners, transforming congregations, you're all awesome. If you can like, subscribe, let your friends, let your family know, or most importantly, anybody that might be out there struggling that would benefit from listening to today's episode, please, by all means, forward it on to them. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you in next week's podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Love and Truth Network podcast. To listen to or view future episodes, please check us out at loveandtruthnetwork.com/podcast. You may also subscribe to Apple Podcast, Spotify, or Google Music. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in a future episode.